Hello, everyone. This is Ed Brenegar, and this is the Eddie Network podcast. And today I'm very pleased to have Anna Brees as my guest. And we're going to introduce each other because we're going to do this as a joint venture across the pond from one another. Anna's in Wales. I'm in North Carolina, in the U.S. And we're going to talk about some important things, and we'll see where it goes. So for those of you who are listening from Anna's world, I am a leadership guy and have been since the mid 80s. And I'm a writer, I'm a consultant, I'm a coach, I'm a trainer, I'm a thought leader in the world of leadership. And I wrote a book it was published 5 years ago, called The Circle of Impact, taking personal initiative to ignite change. And I think what you'll find in our conversation today that Anna is a leader of impact because of how she has taken personal initiative to address things that are important to her. And so that's what I do. You can find me in the world. The best way to find me is to go to Substack and look for Ed Brenegar, one word, EDBRENEGAR. And I write The Future of Leadership Substack, and you'll find a lot of material there that I think will be inspiring, but also will challenge you in your conceptions of what leadership is in the world, and particularly in the world that we're living in today. And it's that background that brings me to Anna. And I found out about you 2 or 3 years ago when you were had begun something that you were categorizing as citizen journalism. So would you tell us sort of who you are and in particular what that project was?
Yeah, of course I will. So obviously I worked at the BBC, I worked at ITV as well as a television journalist. And then we started, I had children. And when they were little, I was in a very fortunate position to be able to be around for them all pretty much most of the time. And I had an admin job with an organisation called the National Union of Journalists, Training Wales. And we used to run courses on how to shoot and edit on an iPhone back in the days of iPhone 4. I then realised, I was just doing admin and sitting in on those workshops at the time, but with my TV background and seeing how these were just getting more and more powerful. The quality was obviously getting better and better. I realized I need to marry these two things up. My background in television journalism, the ability of these incredible things in terms of filming, editing, and publishing to your own platforms. So I started up my own 2-day course, and was doing that with lots of corporate organisations. So I went to an organisation that you may not know called Admiral, or I also taught at Public Health Wales, the Welsh Blood Service, lots of different corporate communications teams, and tried to show them how to film and edit packages like a journalist to put on their own social media. And I call it direct broadcasting. So, but alongside doing that paid work, I was also working with, I was hearing a lot about sort of cover-ups in government and stories that hadn't been really looked at. I would call them, stories that have hidden in the darkness for so long, of injustice and of corruption. And I felt it was important to assist numerous individual whistleblowers and victims and survivors of abuse to tell their own stories, because I think a lot of them had approached the people call it legacy, mainstream, old media, whatever you want to call it, the traditional media that have been around for a long time, and they weren't interested in their stories. And there was a lot of work involved. And I think a lot of journalists would agree with me on that. If you've got an investigative piece, or if you're making an accusation about a particularly powerful individual, for example, you got to be really careful when it comes to media law and making sure that kind of piece of work is a big investment in time. But what I could do is show people how to tell their stories in a very simple way, and to be aware. I mean, we're all doing it, what is a journalist? That's something we do have to ask ourselves. But in terms of getting good lighting and the right microphones to use, how to edit on their mobile so they don't have to buy any extra kits, and then putting subtitles on with around 80% of content was watched with the sound off, things like that. And how to write a great headline, how to get people to engage and listen to your story, but also some really important elements in terms of citizen journalism, I think, which we are missing out on. And that is getting a right of reply, trying to be balanced and impartial as best as you can. And I think this whole, and it comes up, and I'm going to be talking about the book in a minute. This difference between activism and campaigning and journalism. It's become a really hot topic.
Would you define those two different concepts, activism and campaigning? Would you define what that means so that we're clear?
Yeah, I guess there's traditional journalism that I would, when I feel somebody is just simply communicating the facts of what's going on and trying to reflect maybe two different sides of the debate. That feels like the journalist is simply there as a facilitator of providing information and different views. Whereas activism or campaigning, and a lot of people are calling themselves news organizations, but actually they aren't they're putting forward their own views very clearly. There's a lot of their own opinion in their work. And what I tend to find, and this is really important, what I tend to find, and this is a really big concern I have with the new media, alternative media environment, is they're only speaking to people that they agree with. They're not going and getting interviews in challenging situations. So, I could think of any particular topic, but it is a challenge. It is a challenge to get a guest onto your show, full stop. But then to try and then get somebody who thinks you've got a completely different view. This has happened to me recently, actually. Somebody put a comment on one of my Facebook posts. It was very rude. And I would usually just block it, but I didn't block this comment. I actually engaged in conversation and invited them onto my YouTube channel. And that's what I think we need to see more of. And I think it would raise the bar and raise the standard of this very powerful movement that we have, which I call new media, which is very exciting.
Yeah, I agree with you. And to me, it feels like how marketing and public relations has taken over a lot of what used to be just simple storytelling or simple journalism or something like that. But it all has a kind of, it's all agenda driven, and therefore the agenda is not always clear what the agenda is.
Some are better at hiding their agenda, aren't they? There's right. A way of doing it. So it looks, I'm not saying that, for example, BBC don't have an agenda. They just a lot better at hiding it, I would say. Certainly appearing to be balanced most of the time. And if one of their journalists, one of their presenters says something, shows an opinion, they get into trouble and they lose their jobs. Whereas you've got another news channel here called GB News where it's encouraged for them to show their opinion. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, we're getting all of that over here. Well, we have it over here too. So it's not like it's only in your neck of the woods that they say. So you during this process, you began to record interviews with people, and I thought it was fascinating. I thought these interviews were very, very interesting, and I downloaded them. I have a file with many of those on my computer because I really wanted to, at some point, return to those because they were saying things I thought were really valid and valuable for the public to hear. So talk a little bit about what you did there.
So this would be really what I suppose when lockdown happened, and I was approached by somebody called Professor Robert Endress from Imperial College London, and he was critical of Neil Ferguson's modelling report. And I think it was a very important report, Neil Ferguson's modelling report, because it's responsible, I think, for the lockdowns that took place all over the world. Now, this was a really important interview because he was scared. He was scared about the impact it was going to have on his role at Imperial. And I have to find his exact title, but this is somebody who has a right to an opinion, who knows what they're talking about. But he said, I am so horrified by what we're hearing from the BBC. And I'm nervous about doing this, but I've got to do this. He talked to me off the record about the impact of lockdown on his children, for example. And so he came forward, we did an interview, and I let him watch it back because I wanted to make sure he was happy about it before it was published, because it was really a really dark time, Ed, back then, because it was very scary to say anything against the dominant narrative. You got so much abuse. I was removed from a community group where I live here in South Wales. It's only a really small place, and I was in this group on Facebook, and I would be finding out who was giving away a free fridge, or when there'd be a community event taking place, or the local cinema, and it was lovely to be a part of that and to find out what was going on. But during lockdown, I was saying, can we have some debate around this? What about the vulnerable? Is this just some comments, nothing, particularly outrageous? And I got removed, and I continue to be removed from that group. And that was really upsetting and horrible. So just going back to those interviews I was doing, it was a big risk for him to talk. It was a big risk for me to do it. While I had all that corporate work, I did continue doing some with Professional Golf Association on Zoom. But I have to say, I'm not a fan of doing training via Zoom. And I felt it was inappropriate, actually, to be selling my workshops and my courses and doing corporate work at that time when lockdown came along, because I could see there was this huge, desperate need within people's lives for conversation, a debate about how they were feeling, what they were thinking, and voices like Professor Robert Endres that weren't being heard. And then one after the other, they came forward, and that could be someone like Sue Cook, who'd worked at the BBC for years, who said she switched off BBC Radio 4 for the first time in 20 years. A stalwart, I think, in terms of broadcasting, very well known here in the UK. So I remember interviewing her. And then David Rose, who's another journalist. I think the interviews I did with journalists were really interesting. They really did have an impact. And so it was just natural for me. I didn't think for 1 second, this is going to really screw things up here, Anna. And I have to say, I got an email from the head of the legal department from one of the organizations that I worked for. I did some work for, and they said, never say you work for us. Take us off your website. You can't ever tell anyone that you work for us. And I thought, well, this is obviously damaging my reputation here. I'm not going to carry on getting that, whatever I was on, like £1,000 a day doing this training work. That's it for me. That's so how am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to pay off the mortgage and be able to leave the kids my house when I've just done that? Well, I had to. I didn't think about the consequences. I simply had to. When somebody like Professor Robert Endres approaches me and said, there's no balance in what we're listening to, and I've really got some serious and important questions and challenges to raise in relation to that modelling report from Neil Ferguson, I simply had to allow him a platform, give him a platform, and allow him to be heard.
So your situation there is different than what we have here in the US, because we're really a confederation of states, and the states really define how they handle things like public health issues. And where you are, the federal government,
in Wales, the health decisions around health are made by the Welsh government, so they were different. So, for example, it was stricter in Wales, I think. So you had to have a vaccine passport to go to the cinema at one point in Wales, and that never happened in England. So Wales and England and Scotland are different, were different, yeah. Okay.
So I've experienced almost none of what you described. In 2020, when the pandemic began, I traveled by car and truck 3 times across the US. I moved during that year, and I moved myself. I mean, it's not like I hired people to load the truck and unload it, but I drove the truck, and I went across the country 3 times, and I flew across the country once. And I saw what you saw, because there were places where there was a high level of pressure to conform to the social orders that were coming down from Washington. And, my characterization I mean, I went into a Starbucks and without a mask on, and they yelled at me as I walked through the door. You must have a mask on to enter this store. And I said, I don't have a mask. And they said, well, the mayor has declared that everyone must wear a mask. I don't live here. I didn't receive the mayor's edict. And they said, well, we can't serve you. And so I walked out. And it was 2 years before I ever went into a Starbucks again, because I knew that Starbucks headquarters, I don't know this, the implication is that the edict had come down from headquarters that this is the way they were supposed to treat their customers, that they had become agents of the state and they were going to enforce how the social orders were to be carried out. And so there was no allowance for difference of opinion, which is what I think you're describing.
It's just as you mentioned your maths story, that there were so many, Ed, and I don't know what the benefit is of going back then talking about it. I don't want to be one of these people that looks back and talks about the past too much, because I feel people here at Ed at the moment are stuck. They're stuck because there was this massive thing took place, yeah, and they've lost a lot of trust, a lot of broken relationships. They can't see things from other people's perspectives, and they're almost in this frozen state of waiting for the next big crisis to come along, and absolutely believing it will. They've lost hope. They're not really enjoying the freedom that a lot of them fought for in terms of going to protests, for example. But in looking back at these things, I don't know. It's very strange. I mean, I've started a full-time psychotherapy and counselling course. I'm continuing my studies, and I'm fascinated by how people have behaved around over the last 2 years. Sort of what happened back then, where we are now, and especially, and in the book, some really really high-profile people I spoke to. They know that I know. We spoke on the phone. On WhatsApp. They've been running multi-million-pound campaigns, some of them on TV. And I know that they thought and felt exactly the same way I did back then. But it's over now. And I can see they've moved on, and there's no conversation anymore. And I bet they're just breathing a huge sigh of relief that they don't feel that guilt to speak out anymore because it's all over.
Well,
but is it all over? I mean, it's not all over because people are living in this sense of a constant anxiety about what's around the corner.
I think there is an evolutionary change taking place, and what the people who are in authority do not realize is that they have this authority by the permission of the people, and when they lose that sense of connection to the people, then they lose the ground on which we grant them that sense of authority. And one of the things I've talked about it quite a lot during this time, and it came to me in a conversation that I had with a group of business leaders in Nairobi, Kenya, in February, 3 years ago, right now. And I gave a presentation to their group, and the first question during the Q&A was, what do we do about corruption in government? And I said, I don't know. I haven't thought about it, And I knew that it existed, but they see it in a different way. And we had conversation. And I came home, and I came home from that trip, and almost within a week, the pandemic had begun, and there was, all these social orders, the masking and the social distancing and the shelter in place and all those all those things that we're supposed to do to thwart this virus, which did or did not. I mean, it depends on who you look at. But I ended up beginning to write during that time, and for 15 months I wrote steadily, and I produced 7 short books because I thought a short book would be something that people would read. And one of them I wrote 2 books on this idea of the corruption. And one is that the organizations in the world are broken, and they're broken in many ways. And being able to see beneath the surface of what happens in a business or in a government or in a social agency or a church or even in a family, be able to see underneath the surface of it to see why things are broken, um, is really important. And it's broken because they've lost touch with their values. It's broken because there's no trust between the people. It's broken because they don't have a clue as to what their actual impact should be as an organization. I mean, they're into this mechanistic mode of, we got to grind the machine, got to keep it going, regardless of whether we know why or not. We got to keep the machine going. So that was the nature of the first book. The second book, it was entitled "Where Did Trust Go?" And it was really about the breaking of authority and accountability. And so, where do we see accountability in the world today? Well, there's certainly accountability from the upper reaches of organizations towards their people, towards their members, or towards their citizens. There's accountability down, but there's little accountability up. And when we say that you have a vote, well, it's really clear that voting is not a clear form of accountability any longer. I mean, it's as confused as everything else. So the positive thing about this is that we're in this evolutionary moment of change where we are no longer naive about what goes on in the world. And I'm using in describing this, I'm using a concept that was developed back in the early 60s by a guy named Edward Shills. And he talked about the center and the periphery, and that the center was this place where the leaders of a society were the protectors of the values of that society, and the people at the periphery, you and me, are the ones, and we look to those people as our leaders. And so society has a whole is whole, and it's secure, and it's one. It's homogeneous as a society. And what he doesn't write about there, because this was, the early 60s, is what happens when the people at the center, the leaders at the center, abandon those values and they pick up other values that no longer represent the values of the whole community or the whole society. And what I saw in that is what we find is that all these little places on the periphery, think about the people at the edges of society, the margins, become their own centers. And so they begin to build their own little communities, and at one level, that's a very tribal thing. At another level, this is how communities begin to form, and people say, well, we're going to take care of our local people. We're going to take care of the elderly. We're going to take care of the people who are poor. We're going to take care of the people who are mentally ill. We are going to take care of these people. We now know that the people above who run the larger institutions are not going to be able to take care of that. So we're going to take care of it ourselves. So I see that as the next stage of what we're going through. And as a result, there will be strength in local communities that will begin to thwart what the kind of experience you had. So your experience is a lesson to other people that that's not where we want to go. And what we'll do is we'll find a way to begin to build those kinds of relationships back. So we talk about our values, and we talk about respecting one another and trusting one another and being mutually accountable. And we start at the smallest level possible, two people talking in this way and beginning to trust. And then we bring in another person or 3 or 4 people, and we begin to build that kind of network of relationships, as I call it, for the kind of strength that local communities need. So that's the way, that's where I see the evolution or the next stage of this whole thing going. And because the people in the hierarchy of society have kind of outed themselves and say, well, this is really our intention towards all you people. It's going to be more difficult for them to succeed in the future, because the resistance is a word that may describe it, but it's not a very good word to describe the movement, because it's not really a resistance to them. It really is a desire to be more self-sufficient and more interdependent as as people, as families, as communities.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think I see the communities that have formed around that central. You talk about this the circle, and they've lost trust in the central authority, and they're creating their own communities. Um, I mean, I'm exposed to some alternative media communities, and they're not so much local. They're kind of connected on platforms like we've got Telegram here and Facebook and things like that. And I find there's less conversation about taking action and protecting our future as more about fear of what they can do and what they're going to do. This entity has so much power, and I feel there's a lack of hope as well. I feel it very strongly, actually, sort of paranoia and a lack of hope about the future, rather than thinking, well, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to evolve and to grow and to make our leaders of our country um, look more like us, ones we can trust, ones we can have faith and hope in and be excited about our future. If we can look at that, focus on that, not what have they got planned for us next.
Well,
Um,
here's what I've learned um, by talking to people and working in organizations all these years. Um, the PR and the marketing efforts by organizations want us to believe that the people in leadership are leading and that they are the ones who are determining the future of an organization. But what I've learned is, and this is a phrase that I use now, that there is a persistent residual culture of values that persists because it resides in the relationships of people. And if you walk into a corporation, you walk into a local business, you will find that the people who work there develop a culture amongst themselves that is very supportive of the business itself. Because if they're there, more than likely they care about being there. They care about its health as a company, and they go, maybe they would even use the phrase that they love working for this company, and they love it because there is something about that company and the work that they do that matters to them. So this is, I think, the hidden truth about all collective action, that there is this thing that happens with people where they want to work together, and they want to work from a basis of shared values so that their relationships actually have meaning.
Oh, absolutely. And I saw that when I was behind a campaign called against vaccinepassports.com, and it was the most incredible time with reps we had all over the country. We'd meet every week on Zoom, and we gave out 1,000 free t-shirts at a protest in London. And I was very, very, very clear about that campaign being about being against mandates and passports. And but over time, I think people's values changed, that it wasn't so much about that for them, and that community broke down a little bit, I think, because I think they wanted me to be against the COVID vaccine, and I wasn't. I was against the mandation of the COVID vaccine, and the values and the very central values of that was freedom and choice and
Right.
debate. But I couldn't hold on to them, to these people. I couldn't hold on to the group together. I couldn't keep us together based on those values. It's broken down. I mean, but 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 where we're at now is my life, here in the UK, apart from everything being very expensive because of the cost of living crisis that we've got here, because of the energy prices going up, I'm living a life that's free. My children going to school. I can drop my children off at school. I can buy my daughter birthday presents. At one point, I couldn't. You couldn't buy toys. You couldn't buy toys, and it was her birthday. My son doesn't have to sit wearing a mask at his first day at secondary school, 11 years old, on the bus, all day at school, and back on the bus home. He could take it off to eat and when he played PE. I don't live like that anymore. When that happens, it was all consuming for me, the fight inside me to fight that.
Yeah.
I'm horrified, absolutely disgusted, and it's just horrified. I think disgusted is the right word, horrified that the mums I used to work with that I thought would do something did nothing when they saw
Well,
they were sending their own children. And my son, it was not easy, there were children with asthma and their parents weren't asking for mask exemption. Um and it just got worse every day. It got worse and worse and worse on what we were doing to our kids. And I just thought those people I used to work with who did have some influence, I think, in terms of working for these media brands, could have done more. And I would see the odd tweet here and there, and I could see they were dipping their toe in the water, really. I'm not going to name any names, but especially when I was at ITV in Birmingham, I had a lot of junior journalists join, and they all went to Sky, and they were national news presenters and reporters. Um, and I just, what is it? I'm really surprised by this because I knew they were mothers, but I also knew that I also thought to myself, well, they will just completely destroy their career if they do this. They
yeah.
knew what the risks were, I guess, and you don't know a person's individual circumstance, and that literally may have been the only income they had. And if they lost their job, they wouldn't be able to put food on the table. You can't. You do have to appreciate that.
Yeah, we saw that here, where employees would be mandated to have the vaccination, and in order, if you felt like the vaccination wasn't what you wanted, you had to quit. You had to leave the job, and so it's. But the here's the issue that I think that we're facing. It is, for a period of time you can resist and you can be against something, but over time you cannot sustain that kind of emotion because it's essentially a negative emotion. You need to discover something positive and constructive to move forward. And I mean, this is where I have chosen to put my emphasis is on building and restoring and recovering and even reconciling the situations that we're in. Uh, and so that I think it's really important. Now I want to talk about also this book that you have written, which I love it. I love that you have done this. And as I told you in the email to you, I think the cover is killer. It's such a dramatic picture of.
Well, there were big. There were better pictures in terms of video footage and photographs of more protesters. But the significance of that photograph, obviously, is it came to me from someone who was inside the BBC. Obviously, I can't say who that person is, but they sent me that photograph because people in the side New Broadcasting House, which is the main kind of headquarters of the BBC in London, central London, someone inside the building took that photograph. So I think it's a really important, it's a strong cover. The book itself isn't particularly long, and I found it incredibly painful to write, but I felt like I had to get it out. I can't believe what's just happened. It was like the conversations I had, the experiences I had, and there was so much I've missed out. But I've tried to just sit down and think, I have to record this. I have to record this. I don't know what else it was. It was just I was just compelled to record it. And it's very, very much in my, you know, I've sort of set the scene in the first few chapters talking about some of the memories, some of the things that happened. And then it's a very personal experience, actually. It's very much my story.
Yeah, and I think that's important, and I think I'd like to see more people write that kind of story because I think it helps, um, move the debate from policy to the effect upon people, and I think that's what's missing. Um, there's an old line, and I know Stalin used it. Um, what the death of one person is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. It's I think that's where we have been living is in
Yeah,
that world of
it's true.
statistics, which dehumanizes the whole conversation. And uh,
Completely. I agree with you. Yeah. I think um, it's important we share our stories, our really on in a really honest way.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel guilty as well when I look back. I do. I think sometimes so many people watch the one particular interview I did with Dr. Mike Eden, and I think that had such an impact. And I just think sometimes I think that if people said they didn't take the vaccine after watching that, or it had a really massive impact on people's lives, and I feel overwhelmed by that. Actually, feel overwhelmed by that. Um, and I tried to do a follow-up interview with Dr. Mike Eden, which I've put in the book, and he wasn't really keen on that. And I feel that I should have really pushed it. Um, I tried to be as balanced as I could, but I let my emotions take over, and the mum in me, I guess,
Yeah.
the mum in me, um, stopped me from being an impartial, calm, balanced journalist at times. I think I was just furious. This rage came over me. It's going to the park and it all being cordoned off and them tying up the swings. Um, but then I could go to the supermarket the same day. I was able to go to a shopping centre, and my daughter could go up and down the escalator in a packed shopping centre, and I just thought, why aren't people ripping this tape down? Why aren't they unknotting these swings? And in the supermarket, when it was my daughter's birthday, and they deemed toys to be essential items here in Wales, and they put tape on the aisles where you could buy toys. And I thought, if you didn't have a bank card and and you had to buy, you couldn't buy stuff online for whatever reason, you wouldn't be able to buy presents for your children on their birthday. And Mark Drakeford was in charge at the time when that happened here in Wales, and he's still there. And I was very surprised by that, to be honest, because looking back, I think as we've had time to process and reflect on what happened over the last few years, cannot find anyone. I'll be honest with you, Ed. Lots of people, lots of debate around vaccines and masks, whatever, but I cannot find anyone actually who thought lockdown was a good idea. I'm struggling. I'm struggling. Um,
Yeah. I think you're right. I think it's, the only people that feel like it was a good thing are the people who gained uh, greater control over their world as a result of it. And the problem that comes with control is that um, it's a false security. And I think if you look at the history of the world, where you have highly centralized, highly high control oriented societies, that they end up um, failing because there is an inability to cover all the needs that exist in a society. And it's a I would even say that there's a form uh, of mental breakdown. I don't want to call it mental illness because that is unfair to people who actually suffer from mental health issues. But I would say it's sort of an intellectual breakdown of the first order, which believes that I can take control of a whole society and run it, and take care of everyone by whatever means necessary. And I think we've seen this over the last century, that in societies where they have attempted this, they've ultimately failed, and they fail rather rapidly once they reach some kind of tipping point. So I think that's what we see is a failure coming, and that's why I think it's important for us to build our relationships within our community, and build trust within our community, and talk about, okay, what happens if what if name the problem. What happens? How are we going to take care of that together as a community? As a neighborhood, as a family. And I think having those conversations, which says this is how we're going to care for each other in the future, I think is a place to start. And
Absolutely. And I think we do need to heal as well. I mean, but the big problems for people now at the minute, I think, is the cost of food and heating your home. How are we going to stay warm in the winter when you've got very high energy bills? And it's caring for each other and being vulnerable, and building real meaningful relationships and friendships in your community. Um, and yeah, and they become very, very powerful, don't they? They take over that relationship that you have with the national or global leader and the decisions they make. But just going back to this, Ed, I mean, the fact that the children weren't going to school, I think, is a really important one, and no one seems to want to be talking about it anymore. When I, because I think everyone's just so everyone's got some, I think, some trauma over for that period in their lives, and they just have no need to talk about it again because it is important to move forward. Um, but you know, the children in the UK miss more school than any other country in Europe, I believe. I was watching a video about that yesterday, and those children, some of them had mum and dad at home in a garden, but it's those children that didn't have a garden and maybe had a parent who was struggling with maybe lots of children. It was just it was just it was just beyond belief what we put some children through, um, and
Yeah,
it was just
I
awful.
a year ago. I had dinner with friends of mine, and the wife of this couple teaches at a school, and she was talking about how the seniors who were graduating in a month or two had not been in class at the school since their first year of their sophomore year. So they'd gone for a year and a half, 2 years. They'd gone for 2 years without being in the location of the school itself. And she was, she was asking the question. So what is the impact of that? Do they feel a sense of loss? Do they feel a sense of disconnection? And what does this mean for them when they go off to college? What is it? What are they going to think? What are they going to feel? Is there something missing that they were wanting to recapture? Some part of their lost childhood that they would wish they had, and she was just raising the question without having any answers. And but this was what was expected. We're gonna do Zoom, we're gonna teach from Zoom, and we're gonna do these sort of things. And I think societies do these sort of things because they're trying, in the best from the best intentions, they're trying to do something right. So I don't think it's necessarily that they have evil intentions. I think they're trying to do what is best in their own minds, but they're mistaken oftentimes, and the problem becomes when they're unwilling to admit that, well, this was not a good idea. We need to change our policy.
Look, yeah, I mean, even our own Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and it was in August 2022, he actually came out and said, I was against closing the schools and the second lockdown, I think in around the end of 2021. Read the article in the Spectator, but our own Prime Minister now, Rishi Sunak, was against closing the schools. But at the time, he didn't come out. And at the time, I did an interview with a doctor he's called Rick O'Shea. He'd worked for the BBC as a presenter, and he's now a local doctor in Cardiff. And he was talking about, it's not sensible to close the schools. This is really impacting kids, especially vulnerable kids. At the time, he nearly lost his job.
Yeah.
And now we find out our own Prime Minister thought exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's about courage, isn't it? It's about speaking up at the time there's something really, where you see some real injustice. It seems to be important. And if you don't speak up at the time you see and witness injustice as a leader, as someone with influence, you must come back to it and say sorry.
And that's why we need the connective tissue of relationships in a community. Because if I know that my stance on something is going to have an effect upon my neighbor next door, and I'm going to think twice about that, because what he thinks about me is more important than what the president of the United States thinks of me. He doesn't even know I exist. But what my friend next door thinks of me really does matter. It matters to me more than almost anything because he's my neighbor. And I don't think that we have appreciated that because we've never been challenged in such a way where the relationship between neighbors has been threatened by policies that seem to have no sense at all. And so
maybe I didn't care what my neighbor thought because I I said what I thought, and my neighbors didn't like it.
But I think that's part of what I'm saying is that um, we need to. It's not that I have a different opinion than him. He may have a different opinion than me, but I'm going to be. I want a relationship of respect between us, so that I can express my opinion honestly and openly with him, and he can express, and so we can have that dialogue that then becomes a dialogue not just between the two of us, but maybe between four of us or 10 of us,
Well, that
and
would
that
have happened if the media had allowed that dialogue. If they'd allowed to for us to view that horrific situation of COVID and how many people were dying, allowed us to have that relationship where we could understand each other and have a conversation in a respectful way. If they had allowed that, it would have happened in real life at a local level with our neighbours, wouldn't it? That's why it was such a
yeah,
huge failing because
and
they didn't allow it. It was like so black and white. If you don't agree completely with the lockdown, whatever, it was huge amounts of shame poured upon you and embarrassment and horror. Um, ugh, and then that filtered down into conversations with family members and neighbors, etc.
so as we come to the end of our time together, I just want to say your what you have done over these last 3 years has been valuable and has had an impact. Writing your book is a part of that, but also the interviews you've done, the training you've done, your voice, you're just speaking out and saying what you, I think, has had an impact. I know people. When I mention your name to people here in the States, oh yeah, I know about her. So I oftentimes we don't know what the impact is. Oftentimes we don't know if what we're communicating is reaching anyone, but I'm telling you it does.
But has it
And
been a positive impact, Ted? Has
yes,
it been a positive impact or
I think
just an impact?
well, at least the people that I've talked to, it has been. And
Yes.
it's you know why it would not be, I don't know, but other than people are afraid that you're being disruptive, but or what?
Well, yeah, I agree, and I think I can see that there's a lot to be said for listening to the advice of the government, which is then communicated through the media, and us all working together in a
That's right.
situation of a health crisis. Putting on a mask, whether you agree with it or not, is a respectful and wise thing to do because you have to trust your government. So I can see that me coming along and interviewing people who disagree with that and being disruptive and asking challenging questions could be unsettling. But I think it was important that we were allowed to
Yeah.
be. I think it's a very dangerous place where you have thousands, not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of people protesting and not being heard.
So tell folks how they may find you and find your book.
My book is on Amazon at the moment, and it's called Shame: When Journalists Stopped Listening. And I'm also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and Telegram, and YouTube. And I haven't been doing so many interviews lately, Ed, but I do hope to put this on my YouTube channel if that's okay.
Yeah, I would love for you to do that. And so they can find you in all those places. And I thank you for sharing your time with us. And I'd like to talk with you again, maybe at another time as time unfolds and we see. I mean, you have an election coming up, in I think in May there in the UK. I think, if am I right about?
Wait,
I
don't
don't know.
ask me about don't ask me about the
I
the
may be
the
wrong on that.
I'm healing now. I mean, Ed, the thing is, I haven't done many interviews. People will remember those interviews in the Global 150 and the people who sent in their video messages from all over the world to a SIM card that I had. I was working non-stop back then. Now
Right.
I'm doing a full-time course on counseling and psychotherapy, which I think is going to really be very useful for me in terms of taking my own stuff out of the conversations I have. I mean, that's a counseling relationship where you're listening. And also, it'll be very important for me to heal. I think I need to heal and understand and like people
I
again.
hear
Some
that.
people, do you know what I mean? I've lost a lot of respect for a lot of people. I've stopped liking them, and I've got compassion fatigue. I have, and I'm wondering that courage and that care and compassion isn't there the way it used to be. That fight. So I do need this period. So in terms of people trying to find me, that book's there. But I'm a lot quieter now
Okay.
on social media. I am.
Well, I thank you for your sharing your thoughts and your passion. And we before we went online, we talked about what it was like to be a mom in this conversation and this time, and how that has such a huge it's a part of the driver of who you are as a person and why you have been so passionate. And I think it comes out in what we've talked about today. And I think um, we need to listen to moms and appreciate their unique perspective on the world. Fathers are we should appreciate as well, but they come at this from a different perspective, and we all know that. But I think it's worth celebrating the fact that you're a mom and that it's not separate from who you are as a journalist, and it's a part of who you are. It's the whole thing, and so I'm
Well,
grateful
yeah, my
for.
dad's always used to say to me, children are the most important thing in the world, and he made me feel like the most important person in the world. And
For him.
that upbringing I had and the love I had for my mum and dad has just made me who I am today. I think it's given me the courage and the resilience to be so focused on kids and even if I hadn't been a mum though, I'd have still seen the pain and suffering that we were bringing upon our children, and I don't think it would have made a huge amount of difference really. It's a person that I am because of my mother and father. I think that's made me do that work. Yeah.
Well, I thank you, and we'll talk again.
Love to
And
talk again. Thank you ever so much for inviting me
thank
on
you
your
everyone for
channel.
watching. Thank you everyone for watching the Eddie Network podcast and watching Anna Breeze's version of this on her website. And we'll see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye bye. That was